So this is a really simple concept here that I want to get across, but it's very, very practical on a real level. So, quick story. I think it was many years ago, but I was watching a TV show with Puff Daddy, P Diddy, whatever his name is, and I think it was something like Making the Band or one of those shows where they're trying to put together some pop band or something, right? So on this show, there's a scene where they're in the studio, they're working on something. P Diddy's there, and there's an engineer there. His go-to engineer. I forget his name, like Guru or something like that. He was notable enough that they had his name on the screen, but I forget exactly what it was. Anyway, they're in the studio. They're working on something. The engineer's at the computer in front of the console. P Diddy's kind of behind him listening, and he says, "Hey, can you turn that up?" I think it was a kick drum. He's like, "Hey, can you please just turn up the kick a little bit?" And then the camera just stays the whole time, and the engineer pops up like an EQ, and he's like fooling with that, and he pops up another plugin, and P Diddy's standing behind him, and he's just like, "No, just turn it up, man." And then the engineer's like, "Yeah, yeah, yeah, one sec," and he's like fiddling with the EQ of the kick, and he's like changing the low end, and he's like, it wasn't zoomed in on the screen, but you could tell he was like doing all these other things except for just turning up the fader, right? And so P Diddy's he says it like 3 or 4 times, I think. He's like, "Man, just turn it up. Just turn it up. What are you doing?" And the engineer's just basically like blatantly ignoring him and fiddling with these other things, trying to get the kick louder. And finally, P Diddy gets pretty mad. He's pretty pissed, and he's like, "Hey, it's not an EQ thing. Just turn it up. It's not an EQ thing. It's a volume thing. Just turn it up." And then he gets. I think the engineer like turns around and he starts to kind of justify what he's doing. And then P Diddy just gets pissed. He's just like, "It's not an EQ thing. I just asked you to turn it up." And then he turns around and he just like storms out of the studio. Now, obviously, this is TV. It's probably a little bit over dramatic, but honestly, this is, to me, it's so classic, and I think it was real. It was legit, because I don't think they could script that out or plan that. They're not scheming like, "Oh, how can we make a dramatic moment?" I know he'll ask to turn it up, and I'll tweak the EQ. Like, the average viewer is not going to know that, right? So I think this was a real moment. But man, it has stuck with me for all these years, because it's like that saying in my head is just like on repeat now. It's like, it's not an EQ thing, it's a volume thing. And it's such a great example of, and how often do we just overcomplicate stuff? Like, we think, okay, something's not cutting through the mix enough. Okay, I need to add EQ. Oh, what's happening? Maybe I need to scoop out this frequency, or I need to make sure the bass has a specific window between 80 and 100 hertz where nothing else is playing, and like, stuff like that. We get so complicated on everything, when honestly, sometimes all we need to do is turn up or down the fader. Like, really, that's it. I mean, I just finished mixed revisions for a record I just mixed, and it's beautiful because the revisions complemented each other. So, they say they wanted more of that slappy sound in the bass, but they also wanted the keys up, and they also wanted the guitars down a bit. But that all fits together, because when I turn the guitars down, voila, I can hear the slap of the bass more, and I don't really have to do much to the EQ to make that happen. I want you to apply this to your mixes. Are you spending enough time just balancing the faders? Like, how often are you going to EQ and compression and all these other complicated things, when really you just need to change the balance of the faders between the tracks? And it's tough, because this is something that is not necessarily teachable. You can't, there's not like a formula. Like with EQ, I can say, okay, on a kick drum, like 8K sounds good, 60 hertz sounds good. It also sounds good if you do a big scoop around 800 or 400 or something. With balance, it's just feel, right? It's just using your ears and what feels right, what feels like the right balance to give you the right energy, and you have to go with that. But again, we complicate it so much. We try to do all this extra processing to get something to cut through or to stop masking something else, and we forget the simple things like just moving the fader. So are you spending enough time in your mixes just addressing the balance and making sure that that is done properly? Automation is a huge tool here. So sometimes again, we reach for processing to address a specific problem in a specific area of a song, when simply automating the fader is going to give us the result we want. So for example, again, on a record I was just mixing, there's sections where there's lots of space with the drums, where the snare is just on its own, the kick's just on its own, and everything has space to cut through. There's also really busy sections where it's super fast double kick, and then he's got snare on the same time as that, and that makes it a lot harder for the snare to actually cut through above all that stuff. Now, when that happens, you might be tempted to reach for EQ and be like, I need more processing on this snare. I need more brightness. I need more attack. I need more compression, distortion, whatever it is. And you start to do that just because this one section has a problem. But you know what would also work is just automating down the kick and automating up the snare at that section, even on those specific snare hits. Like, again, sometimes you don't need to keep beating up the track with processing. Sometimes it's just a matter of automating and addressing those balance issues throughout the song as the song evolves and moves and different layers are coming and going and things are happening. You maybe don't need to do a crazy processing to make sure every single section is proper. That's probably not going to end up the best way to do it in your mix. Sometimes you just need to let things evolve and automate just simple things like volume. Another one that we often forget is panning. I mean, when we think of separation in the mix, obviously we're thinking of EQ, right? We're thinking of frequencies not overlapping too much, not masking certain instruments from others. But, and that's true for sure. That's why I recommend EQing in mono to make sure you can really hear where those frequencies are masking each other. But again, how often do we forget just panning? Maybe you've got a bunch of stuff up the middle, synths, guitars, all, the kick and snare, the vocals, the bass. It's all up the middle, and then there's another layer you need to add in, and you've got that up the middle too. And maybe it's more of a lead guitar type thing, and it feels like it should be up the middle, at least your initial impression. But then, it's just too much. It's getting too crowded there. So obviously we're going to think, as engineers who like to make things complicated, we think, okay, we've got to carve out EQ, blah, blah, blah. These frequencies are masking. And what about just turning that pan knob? Throw it off to one side. I'll do this often in a mix if I feel like the center's getting too crowded. I like having a lot of things up the middle, but if it's getting too crowded and I'm running out of space, and I make sure I utilize that pan knob. If I'm struggling to get something to feel separate or like I can hear it in the mix and it's too crowded, just pan it out and go all the way to the left or right, and it's like all of a sudden it's like, oh yeah, I can hear that part now. That adds a lot. So again, fader. Changing the fader, the balance, the volume, and the panning. Those are two of the simplest tools that we have that should be almost kind of like the first things that you think of when it comes to addressing a problem in a mix. Think of those two things first before you reach for everything else. Like, just ask yourself, could I fix this with panning? Could I fix this by just changing the balance of things? See if that works, and if that's not feeling right, then you continue on and maybe you go for more complex, more involved processing. You can also bring this back to, maybe an in-person experience in a session. Now, I'm guilty of this too, just like in that P Diddy clip I saw. The band asked for something simple, like, hey, can we hear this a little louder, or can I, whatever it is. Usually it's something just like, hey, can you turn this up or turn this down? And again, being engineers, we like to complicate things, and we start fiddling with EQs, we start fiddling with effects, maybe if something feels too louder in front for a band and they want it down, it's like maybe we're like, oh, if I just add some delay or reverb, that might help it sit back in the mix. When really they really just want you to turn down the fader. Like, when you've got clients in the room, don't overcomplicate things. Like, always go for the simplest thing first. Whatever's going to get the result fast, the band is going to love that because they want to keep the session moving. There's nothing worse than being an artist in a session and you're just asking for something that's simple in your mind, and the engineer's going on down this rabbit hole of EQ and compression and effects and blah blah blah. Like, keep the session moving, keep it simple. I like processing as we're tracking and having it sound like a record as we're building it, but I try to be as quick as possible with that. I don't ever go like overboard and keep the band waiting too long while I'm doing that stuff. So keep it simple, not only in your mixing in terms of the steps that you're going through in your head, but also during sessions. Like, keep it simple. And when something's wrong, when you're troubleshooting something, even like a signal chain, don't go to the most complex thing. At least first just start with the most simple solutions possible, starting at the source, and then work your way down to the more the deeper layers of everything if you're trying to solve problems. So like I said, this is a really simple concept, but it's very practical and I think very powerful, something we need to remember. And I hope that I've drilled that little saying in your head the same way it was drilled in my head when I saw that little TV clip. It's not an EQ thing, it's a volume thing. Just have that playing in your head as you're mixing. And sometimes it will be an EQ thing, often it will. But having that in your head might help you catch yourself sometimes when you're overdoing something and overcomplicating something, when first you just need to step back and just move the fader a bit to see if that fixes all the issues. And chances are, it can do a lot in a lot of different situations. And this goes along with my whole kind of ethos of less is more, right? Less layers, less processing, less worrying about stuff. And obviously you guys have seen my mixing courses, my videos. I'm not afraid of using EQ or compression. I use a lot in some cases when it needs it. So this isn't about EQ or compression or processing being bad at all. It's just about making sure that you're not doing things, that you're not overdoing things without just thinking through of why. Why am I doing this? Is there a simpler way? Am I just making this complicated as an excuse to use the tools instead of just keeping it simple and just mixing by balance? The fundamental things, balance and panning. We often forget about those things with all of the amazing tools we have now. So always be asking yourself, what is the simplest fix? And is this a volume thing or is this an EQ thing? So leave a comment below. Let's get a discussion going again. And let us know, what is the one instrument that you find yourself often overcomplicating? And what is a specific area? Maybe it's a specific track like kick or snare or bass or something that you find yourself just piling on all these plugins and processing and kind of neglecting. Like, is there something that you're realizing that, like, maybe a mix you're working on right now and you realize, oh man, maybe if I just adjusted the balance, maybe it would fix my problems. Let us know what that area is for you, and let's help each other out here with some extra tips on this topic. All right, guys, again, thanks for watching as usual, and we'll talk again soon on the next frequency upgrade.